Welcome to today's episode of the Founders Lounge, where I talk to some of the most interesting UK founders. I try to learn from them, share their stories, and just have interesting conversations about their business. In today's episode, my guest was Jordan Schlipf. He is a serial entrepreneur and currently the CEO and co-founder of Rainmaking Venture Studios. So what they do is they launch startups in collaboration with large corporations. And Jordan has a wealth of experience in building businesses, and he shared his whole, how they come up with an idea and how they recruit CEOs and founders to then execute on that idea. And he just shared their whole blueprint, which I thought was really, really fascinating. And he has this incredible clarity on the strategy and how they do it. So I think you're going to learn a lot if you're interested in building businesses, launching startups. Jordan has his very specific way of doing it. So I hope you're going to enjoy it. If you do, if you like these kind of things, please subscribe because we have a lot more interesting content coming your way. And leave us a review, leave a comment if you enjoyed the episode. Thank you. Jordan, welcome to the Founders Lounge.
Thanks, Mattis. Pleasure to be here.
You are doing some things that I always found really, really interesting. And that's why I'm very excited to talk about it today. And we'll get into venture building in a second. But maybe before we start with the things that you're doing right now, I thought it would be interesting to I think it's always good to give a little bit of background of who you are and what you've done in the past. I think it kind of sets the ground for, the rest of the episode then. It gives a little bit of background of where you're coming from and what you've done in the past. So let's just start with that. You
Sure.
started a few businesses in the past. So can you talk a little bit about that?
Yeah. So, the high level summary is I've spent the vast majority of my career as a founder and CEO of various different tech startups. I've definitely had my share of failures along the way, but I've had enough successes to stay in it as a way of life and as a sort of a prolonged career that's still going, hopefully. And after, a sort of small lucky exit, having made some money, I made the transition to the investment side. So initially as a business angel, investing my own money into startups. And then I transitioned into professionalizing that as a VC at a global early stage VC fund. And to be honest, I found the role of a traditional venture capitalist quite slow and quite boring. It's mainly just watching and waiting. And there's a few other things, but ultimately I decided that actually having jumped to the other side of the tables or where on the investment side, I found that actually I was much more interested in being a founder and building stuff than just sort of passively investing. So I sort of left the fund, and then I took a brief stint in academia, teaching entrepreneurship education, both at an MBA level and an MSc level at Oxford and UCL, respectively. And that was mainly to sort of scratch the itch of like, should I have been an academic? What was that like? Maybe I'm missing out. And at the same point, it was really about kind of the impact you could have on sort of aspiring entrepreneurs' lives, right? With giving them the skills and the mindsets to be successful and kind of try to avoid some of the mistakes I made in my early days. And so did that for a couple of years, which was super exciting, but ultimately academia was even slower than being an investor. So I left academia, and then I set up my own startup studio or venture studio. And my co-founders and I put about, 4 or 5 million of our own capital into it and started trying to sort of systematize the process of building multiple startups a year. And that's actually how I met Rainmaking. So Rainmaking began as a company builder. And as I was building my startup studio, someone introduced me to the Rainmaking guys. So essentially a collection of mainly Danish serial entrepreneurs who are running this quite unique company builder model between London and Copenhagen. And so I flew out to Copenhagen, met with them, shared learnings about what we were doing at my studio and what they were doing in their experience, because they were way more advanced than I was at the time, which is really, really interesting. And then ultimately my startup studio ended up sort of collapsing on one one startup, one venture, which we spun out, raised, Series A round, and off it went. And most of my co-founders went with that business when they raised the money. I didn't. It was in the ad tech space, and although I could see the investment case for it, it wasn't something I was passionate about to be one of the sort of co-founders, if you will, and take on that investment and responsibility of building that business. So that left me floating around. Um, and so I ended up joining Rainmaking as a kind of late co-founder. And I've done a variety of things within Rainmaking as we built the business over the last, I don't know, 6, 7 years. But today, I lead our no fees co-investment venture building model, but with corporates. So I've kind of come back full circle to the venture studio model, made a few tweaks, and we do kind of a unique approach of how we build startups from scratch, and doing so in partnership with large corporations.
All right, before we continue, I want to take a second to talk about our sponsor. I've always been saying that one of the best ways to learn about business is by working closely with a smart and successful entrepreneur, and this might be your opportunity. Our sponsor is a company called Judge Me. Judge Me is a Shopify product review plugin, and they're the number one plugin on Shopify. They're literally, if you look at the Shopify App Store, they're in the first spot. They're bootstrapped, and they managed to outcompete other companies that raised hundreds of millions of dollars by just being smarter and building a better product. They were started by PJ, who was also a guest on the Founders Lounge, episode 54, so I recommend you to check it out. They recently moved their headquarters to London, and they're looking for smart people to join them. They're looking for product managers, engineers, and they're looking to fill other roles as well. So check out careers.judge.me and see if you find any role that you like and apply. So that's careers.judge.me. Now, enjoy the rest of the episode. Awesome. Okay, there are a lot of directions that we can take this now, and I think the venture building is definitely something that we'll probably talk for I would imagine the most part of the episode, because I think that's very interesting, and I think a lot of people will find it interesting. I personally was always very excited about. Now, maybe just before we get there, if we go a little bit back to so you said. So you started a few businesses. Some of them worked, some of them didn't. One of them was a successful exit. Can you talk just a little bit more about what that business was, so I understand a bit more about your background there?
That bizarrely is not really. It's the one non-tech startup. So the first bit of money I made was one of the first businesses I got involved with was actually children's pushchairs. So manufacturing basically like a bugaboo or a brand new hardware products. So children's pushchairs for parents, and I joined a friend of mine to do that. Or unexpectedly ended up joining as sort of co-founder in that business. We had mass manufacture in China, and we were distributing product in Europe. And there was a lot of IP that had gone into the development, and essentially, the business got approached by a big US manufacturer called Evenflow, that had huge contracts with Walmarts and built, manufactured a bunch of different things from like baby bottles to a variety of different things and sort of some cheaper strollers. And we were sort of doing a really high-end off-road type stroller. It sounds off-road is a bit weird, but it had a quite unique suspension system at its
Okay.
core, which allowed it to sort of go up pavements, down pavements, many ways downstairs with the baby remaining sort of stable. So it was kind of genuinely like a sort of Range Rover on steroids for the pushchair world. So
Wow.
yeah, bit of a weird one, but it was one of my first forays into kind of the nitty gritty of like everything from how do you deal with VAT and how do you import stuff and like, warehousing and fulfillment, brand building, health and safety regs in different countries and, raising money. And that was a real journey. When I joined that, I'd done none of that. My first job out of university was actually in investment banking. I did corporate finance, M&A. And so I went from basically being a big ticket M&A banker to, spending 3 months at a time in southern China, at the like on site at the factory, trying to deal with production issues and trying to get stuff in boxes and in containers and being shipped around the world.
That's interesting. And how's that transition for you? Is that did you find that pleasant or interesting, like going from, I don't know, fancy office, working in banking, to then I would imagine like a scrappy startup building physical products?
Yeah. I mean, look, it was hugely, it's kind of interesting because often when people ask me, like, how did you get into entrepreneurship or becoming a founder? And, genuinely, it's sort of by accident. It wasn't planned. How it really happened was a friend of mine had spent quite a few years building this business, or actually developing the technology and trying to design a new pushchair, and put quite a lot of money into it with his co-founder, a girl called Jackie. And originally, I'd quit banking, and this was just before the financial crisis. Not that I knew that was happening. It just happened to be. I think at the time I was so like, oh my God, Lehman Brothers is so undervalued. We should probably buy stock. So that's just like how clever, inverted commas, I was. Right, I had no idea it was coming, despite like kind of being heavily involved in investment banking. Anyway, but I quit because I'd made the decision investment banking wasn't for me. It wasn't really driving the purpose or the kind of meaning, and I wasn't becoming the human being I wanted to be, despite the fact that I was getting paid insane amounts of money. So, to the shock of pretty much everyone in my family, I just basically quit. I had no plan what to do, and I sort of took some time off, and I got a bit bored after like a month of sort of sitting on the beach. And my friend Chris, who was doing this pushchair business, said, "Look, could you help me build like a financial model?" I was like, "Yeah, I could do that in my sleep." So I started helping him build this like model, and it was a full operational model from scratch about like how it was, just full operational financial model. And in order to build it, I had to understand stuff. I was like, well, look, what's the duty code, and like how does like this work on import, when are the payments and tax? And so I went like full geek mode on it and built this very, very detailed model. Anyway, as I was sort of helping them build the model, this then translated into, hey Jordan, could you actually help us raise some money? Like, we really need to raise some money. Could you help us do that? And so I was like, yeah, sure. And I kind of did a deal where I said, look, I'll write the business plan, and, it's be fun, and we'll start pitching it to a bunch of investors. And, I'll tell you what, if anything, don't pay me anything, but like, if we do raise some money, pay me a sort of like, not an introducer fee, but sort of like a little bit of the money raised comes back to me as a kind of, for efforts put in. And so ended up writing this business plan, pitching to a bunch of investors, trying to find investors. And this was like in the early days where like venture capital didn't really exist. And also we weren't really a tech startup. It was kind of a bit weird. So did that. And how I ended up becoming a founder was ultimately we ended up raising a bunch of money. And at this time, I'd actually gone to a tech transfer VC fund. I was working there for a bit. And they were like, called me up and was like, we've got like, 500,000 in, we raised what we wanted. Great. This is amazing. And in my mind, I was thinking, well, that's a new pair of shoes for me. I'm going to get my money, get basically my belated fees. It was brilliant. And what I wasn't expecting is they then turn around and said, well, look, Jordan, actually, we really loved working with you. You bring a really unique skill set to the company. And actually, we'd love you to join as sort of co-founder number 3 and like convert your fees into an equity position, and become a director of the business, and let's go build it. And I was very flattered at the time, and I didn't really think that much of it. And we went out for beers at this VC fund I was working at, this tech transfer, a deep science-based business called H2O Venture Partners. We went to the pub on Friday after work, and around there I was talking to the 2 managing partners, David and Paul, and I was like, this pushchair business that I'd been working on, because I told them I was trying to help them fundraise. And I said, yeah, we've got the money, and they've kind of, the founders, Chris and Jackie, have kind of very kindly offered to convert the equity, and become a co-founder. And I was sort of laughing it off, and both the managing partners at the fund said something to me which I'll never forget. They said, Jordan, you have the rare opportunity to go from root to fruit, to figure out if you're as smart as you think you are. And I was like, what do you mean? I was like, that's a bit insulting. He's like, no, seriously. And I said, he's like, you've written the business plan, you've raised the money, you've got no more excuses. you can go build this business and one of two things will happen. Either it will turn out as you planned and you'll be
Mm-hmm.
hugely successful and you don't invite us to your yacht on the Med, or it won't, but you will have learned so much in trying to build that business that you will be, 100 times more valuable for us at this VC fund because you'll actually have real operational experience. And because it was a deep science based fund, you're actually trying to build the hardware and bring IP to market, had some actual real relevance. And so they were like, do you know what, Jordan? I think you should probably go and do this. You're still young, have a crack. Worst case scenario, like it doesn't work out, you have a position back at the fund, just come back to us.
Mm-hmm.
Um, and I thought about that and I was like, that's a very good point. And so next thing I knew, I took Chris and Jackie up on their offer and found myself in southern China doing mass manufacture, trying to build a brand, worrying about safety labels, like all sorts of weird stuff.
Uh,
So yeah,
okay. So that's a good explanation because I hear sometimes people say, I became a founder by accident, and I'm like, what exactly does that mean? Like, how does that happen by accident? A lot of people like
yeah,
try really hard to become a founder. So I think that's a very good explanation that you provided there, and as well as I know a lot of people who work, well, not that many, but I know people who work in finance, and it's an interesting job because very often you'll hear it's a very obviously very well paid, but not necessarily the most fulfilling, I suppose, kind of job. And I think it's an interesting challenge for people who work there because like, well, I kind of want to, it's a little bit similar to, I used to live in Switzerland for a few years, and I feel it's a little bit similar. On one hand, it's amazing. It's like everything works really well. It's super safe. It's
yeah,
just everything's taken care of. Such a great quality of life. But then on the other hand, it just doesn't feel like real life. It's a little bit, it's very quiet. It was very hard for me to actually connect with people. So I was like, man, I don't know. It's such a hard choice. Like, well, everything's great here, but I don't feel like I'm living life. So should I leave or should I stay? Well, eventually I decided to leave, and I came to London, and I feel much more alive here. So I think that was a good decision, but it's a hard decision to make at that point because financially it's great, very safe.
yeah,
Objectively it feels like the
yeah,
perfect country to live, or maybe when you work in finance, it feels like the perfect job to have, and parents are proud, and friends are
yeah.
jealous, and so on. So it's kind of hard to make that switch
It
and
is.
go
It
into
is
the
really, it
uncertainty
is
of
really hard,
yeah.
and it is really hard. And I think I'm not gonna, because I'm not actually that old, but you know what I mean. When, when I after university, I went into banking. Like, the reality of the situation was like entrepreneurship was never, while I was at university or after, like, it was never really talked about as a career option or a path. I didn't know
Mm,
anyone. There wasn't even any like educational courses that was like you could learn entrepreneurship. It didn't exist. There wasn't even an entrepreneurship module within an MBA. Right? That stuff
mhm,
genuinely didn't
mhm.
exist. The London startup scene didn't really exist.
Uh-huh.
And so, kind of, I remember when I was doing this pushchair business, and people are like, "What are you doing?" And I'm like, "Oh, I'm running this pushchair business, like kind of like an entrepreneur." And it's kind of like a dirty word, but but it was like people were like they didn't know what box to
Oh
put
wow.
you in. You'd go to like I say cocktail
Mhm.
parties. That sounds. I'd go to someone's house for like drinks, or you'd be in the pub and you'd be talking to people in London, and they're like, "So what do you do?" And it's like, you suddenly said something that was like out of the norm, and then was like, "Well, what's that?" And like, what do you mean? And you'd be like, oh, I'm building this pushchair. And they're like, what? But like, you're a parent? I'm like, no. And they're like, what do you mean? And then, anyway, it was kind of a bit weird, but like, people didn't quite get it. But to your point about why I found it really hard is that the social network, like my parents were really against it. And
Mm,
my wider sort of close family and friends and social network like didn't get it. And so I kind of like, so I was the first person in my family to go to university. And so I went to university as the first one ever. I came out. My father started work at 14 in a bakery and then became a chef and then ended up owning
mm,
restaurants. And so, he was a very successful, genuine, like he would never use this word, but the truth is he is an entrepreneur. He built a restaurant business, which ended up having, 4, 5, 10, or depending on the height, 15 restaurants under the group, this small restaurant group. And, he did very well in the end. But he would never describe himself as an entrepreneur. He would say something like, a chef or a restaurateur. But I'm like, yeah, restaurant entrepreneur. You've built a business from nothing. You gave people, you employed people, and you've been on this journey. But weirdly, like when I quit banking, and my parents came from a different generation, they just couldn't get their heads around how I could quit without another job lined up. They were like, well, where are you going next? And I was like, I've got nothing. And they were like, what are you doing? Like, how could you, you've given up all this money. This is like mental. What do you mean? And, it was a real struggle for them. And they, it wasn't, of course, my parents, they love me and they support me, but it wasn't, and when I explained this to friends, they didn't get it either. So I think actually looking back on it now, the hardest thing about making that decision, which I genuinely believe, now it wasn't a choice to go down the entrepreneurial route. It was simply a choice of saying, I don't want to continue in this banking role. I have no idea what I'm going to do next, but I'm going to believe and back myself that I'll figure it out. But I know I don't want this, so I'm just going to call it and I'm going to leave. And the truthful answer back then, you were also working so many hours, realistically, how could you find the time, let alone the emotional space to figure out what you wanted to do next while working, 80-hour weeks? And so I kind of instinctively knew that, but a lot of people railed. My girlfriend lost her shit at the time. She's like, "What do you mean?" It's like, "You're just going to be a bum. What are you going to do?" I'm like, "I'm not giving up, right?" It's not like, but it was quite, the social pressure at the time was quite tough. And anyway, it was quite tough. But it does. I mean, I think today's generation, and I don't want to use those words of millennial or Gen Z, but just slightly younger people than myself, I think they've got a much better connection, or just generally, even people in my age, as we've gotten to 2022, have evolved or matured, progressed to the point where we are asking ourselves, what is the purpose and what is the meaning I get out of my career beyond remuneration? Right?
Yeah.
I think there is a lot of truth where, our parents' generations, they worked to live. And now we sort of expect a bit more than that.
Yeah.
And I think that's generally a good thing, right? In terms of talking about the work that you do and what kind of impact does it have on people and the planet, and all of those aspects of the wider aspect of how you choose to spend the vast majority of your living life.
Yeah. Yeah, absolutely. I think that's changed a lot. I'm probably slightly younger than you, and I think when I started working, I was already, definitely my parents would still be, working for money and looking for safety, and they just wanted me to do something safe. And whenever I do something crazy, they're like, "Oh my God, what is wrong with you? Can you just, go back to a normal job or whatever?" But they do also support me. They're very, very supportive and everything. But now, I think that the younger generations even more. There's much more of a search for just purpose and doing something meaningful. And now even more just doing something good for the planet as well, as you were mentioning, right? So you brought up something interesting, which is it's almost unimaginable. Today, being an entrepreneur, I think for most people it's seen as something cool and interesting and, respected. While you said when you were starting, it was almost like you almost didn't want to say that you're an entrepreneur, right? It was something awkward. And you said that there was not much of an ecosystem in the UK or in London specifically. How did you see, and now today I see London as the center of startups in Europe. I think it's one of the places. You've got Berlin, you've got London, but I would say that London is probably more of a center where things happen. So I'm curious, and you're quite you played a role in that development with with your venture building studios and so on. How did you see the ecosystem in London evolve? I'm curious, what's your view on that?
Well, I have seen it evolve, and I've lived it. When I got so after the pushchair business, I floated around and ultimately I ended up doing a tech startup. And I went through an accelerator program back then, which was called Springboard Mobile, and Springboard became Techstars London. But Techstars wasn't
Uh-huh.
out of the US at that stage. So I went through an accelerator program with my own startup. We raised some money, and it was just like a legitimate tech startup. And at that time in London, I think Google Campus had just opened, like when I was probably in my second year of that. And I remember going to like the campus cafe, and it was literally empty. And it was like
Hmm.
10 people hanging out, and you'd hang out and be like, my God, you're also a founder. And then, it really went from about 40 people who would meet up and genuinely kind of like often, buy beers we could barely afford, crying about how our startup wasn't really working. And then there was like two or three people that were doing like really well. There was like moo.com that was doing super well, Last FM, the radio that was doing
Uh-huh.
super well. And we were
Uh-huh.
like, oh my God, they're doing well. And there was this agency, digital agency called Berg that was doing really, really well. And, that was it. It was like 40 people and then like these outliers of Last FM and Moo. And there's like literally just this tiny little ecosystem, and it grew, and we watched it grow. And a big part of the London ecosystem, like building it from a community standpoint, was actually the Three Beards. I'm not sure if you ever come across I'm going to say the Three Bens, like Ben Sutherland. No, it was two Bens and one.
No.
Anyway, the Three Beards who ran these community events like
Oh, Three
digital,
Beards, yeah.
like
Did they have a job board as well at some point?
yeah, they did Unicorn Hunt.
Yeah.
.io,
Yeah,
which
that's
they
right.
then
Yeah, I've heard
launched.
of them. Yeah.
Yeah, so Three
I've heard of
Beards.
them, but I don't know much about them.
Yeah, so they were really instrumental in building the ecosystem because they would just do these events. So they ended up also doing like Silicon Drinkabout, which then they ran
Uh-huh,
out to
yeah.
a bunch of different, countries or startup ecosystems around the world. But really, they did a lot of events like these bump, meetups. There was always a summer barbecue called Digital Sizzle. There was these big like parties, and I mean, it sounds like party, but it was really about bringing the community together. And back
Hmm.
then, it was really open. It was like VCs would turn up to meetups. Like, you'd be hanging out because there wasn't that many people. And so it really
Hmm.
then evolved to kind of where you are today, where, there's probably more accelerator programs than you could shake a stick at. No one really goes to campus anymore. There's more like co-working's freaking everywhere. The VC industry has gone bananas. The assets under management are crazy. Angels now
Hmm.
exist, right? There's even like huge syndicates of angels, and like the regulation has changed. SAS. There's been a huge evolution of London really turning up as a legitimate startup ecosystem, and is now, like you say, top two, top three in the world, right? Outside of Silicon Valley, flip a coin between New
Hmm.
York and London,
Yeah.
I'd say.
Yeah.
Maybe, okay, Austin, Texas is now growing, but like in Europe, for sure, number one. And the reason why I've always been a mass advocate of London versus Berlin, and we used to have devs in Berlin and an office in Berlin, is Berlin never had the concentration of the money, the VC. Also,
Uh-huh.
what is interesting to say is Berlin had really great dev talent. They tended to have a lot less capable CEO talent, and they
Uh-huh.
had a lot less mature venture capital scene, and basically zero engagement from corporates. And
Uh-huh.
when you looked at London, what you actually had, London was, this powerhouse for all these professional services firms, from, banking to legal to management consulting to accountancy. And it had a real concentration, right? So there's a massive density of really interesting talent from across Europe living in London. Less so in Berlin. Very much dev talent. So you had a lot of Eastern European dev talent go to Berlin because it was super cheap and you could do some startup stuff. But you didn't really have the breadth of the talent, and you had a lot less capital available because all the funds were being raised in the UK. And so, yeah, that's kind of what sort of left behind a bit.
Interesting. Do you think, so you said there's very good technical talent in Berlin, but less CEO talent. Is that due to education? Is that due to the industry, the kind of businesses that there are, or what creates that talent?
Um, so here historically, I mean, I don't really do much stuff in the early startup ecosystems these days, but historically it was just because Berlin was the political capital of Germany. It was super cheap, but there's no industry there. The only two companies that
Hmm.
actually had offices in Berlin was Deutsche Bahn and something else. But that's it.
Hmm.
And there's no, there wasn't really a density of like ex-bankers, ex-lawyers, ex-management consultants. And yeah, there's like one or two like technical universities like that were good. Sorry, or just universities that were good in Berlin. But again, Germany is so diverse. So the unique thing about Germany is its population distribution is very atypical to everywhere else in Europe. So in like say London or France is the same thing. You have the capital, London, like 12 million people, and then in Greater London, the next biggest city has 1 million, right?
Hmm.
Birmingham,
Hmm.
Manchester, whatever, literally one. It's like it's a
Yeah.
tenth of the size. Paris is the same. Germany is not that way, right?
Hmm.
The top 10 cities combined have something like 20 million people in Germany. Where are the other 60 million people living? Right? And it's so diverse, and it's a byproduct of World War II, right? So, when Germany got split up in East and West, actually all the industries just kept popping up. So that's why, you've got companies based in Frankfurt, in Stuttgart, in Essen, in Bonn,
Hmm.
right?
Yeah.
There's no central hub in Munich, right? In
Yeah. Yeah.
Berlin,
Yeah.
in Dresden. And so there's a real
Hmm.
diversity of population. And without that density, the cities aren't that big. And without
Hmm.
that sort of serendipity, that density, that precocity that cities give birth to, it just doesn't really compete.
Yeah.
So the truth is, they never had the depth of concentration of just corporates in general, as well as a huge professional services industry, which London always had.
Hmm.
Finance, legal, consulting, whatever. So if you were a really good corporate
Fascinating.
person, you wouldn't really work for the nationalized train system, Deutsche Bahn. I'm not saying good people work, but
Mm.
like if you're working in amazing, corporate land or whatever, or also even universities, there's like one or two good universities in Berlin, but the others were elsewhere in Germany. Whereas in London, okay, yeah, you've got Oxford and Cambridge, but the reality is you had UCL, you had Imperial, there's a real density, and everyone tended to, after
Yeah.
university, come into London to get their first jobs. So it's just from a geographical standpoint, it's very different.
Hmm. Fascinating. Wow, that's a really good. It's funny. I was actually before I moved to London, I was considering when I decided I was going to move out of Switzerland. So that was just about 4 years ago. I was deciding between Berlin and London. So I spent about a month or so in Berlin, and I was already spending a lot of time in London before, so I knew London. So I just wanted to kind of test the grounds in Berlin, and I just didn't. I don't know. I just didn't feel the same. I just didn't feel the same in London. I just felt like there's so much happening, and there were so many interesting people, and it's you could find anything. I don't know. I just felt more at home, or more. I should say, I just felt so much more excited about coming to London. While in Berlin, I was always like, yeah, okay. I mean, I don't know. I don't know why there's all this the hype about this city. I just didn't get it. So it was much more a different kind of evaluation at that point. I just didn't feel like it was a place for me to be, while London always excited me a lot. And yeah, I still think it was the right decision to do.
Well,
Um,
Berlin is ridiculously cheap
oh,
in
for
comparison
sure,
to
yes.
London. So
Yeah,
that's it's one of its main points. Like the cost of living is tiny in comparison to London. Um,
for sure. Yeah, there's definitely that.
but yeah,
But yeah,
don't get me
it
wrong, I
was.
love Berlin
It
actually.
just didn't feel.
I find it quite. I
Yeah.
enjoy that sort of cultural hipster vibe, and I've had a lot
Uh,
of fun in Berlin. And as I said, we've had offices in Berlin many times, many years. It's a cool city, but yeah, like for me, London. Yeah, I just gravitate like you. I just gravitate towards London. I mean, I grew up in Hong Kong, and so I grew up in
aha.
this hugely dense, like, huge skyscrapers every block. I grew up in Hong Kong, and so when I came to London, I remember being
Ah.
like, London
Yeah.
was like for me, London was already the countryside. I was like, hold on, I can see trees and there's like a big park. Like, London felt like the countryside to me. And so I was like, but the interesting element is when you compare London to other cities across Europe or whatever, it's like, I was like, well, hold on. Like some of these other cities felt like, I mean, that's just like, I'd be like, I just feel like I'm asleep. There's nothing going on. And it was still a big
Oh
shock because like
wow.
Hong Kong, a bit like New York, is a 24-hour city. Like nothing shuts. Like anything. Yeah. If you want random noodles at 3 o'clock in the morning, you'll get them. Like if you want a foot massage at 3 o'clock in the morning, you'll get a foot massage as well. Right. And then you come over to like UK or Europe and it's like, I mean, Germany's a lot worse, but like, it's like things like I remember when pubs were shutting at like 11. I was like, what? It's like, I don't understand this. But anyway.
Yeah, that's funny. Yeah, because for me it's exactly the opposite. I come from the actual countryside in Slovenia, a small country, from a small village in a small country. So coming to London is like, oh my God, overwhelming. But no, but in a good way. I mean, I love it. So
Awesome.
that's why I'm here. Okay, so let's shift over to venture studios. So that's something that you've been doing now for many years, right? And I always found it fascinating because I think from the outside, it seems like, well, you just build businesses. How exciting and how interesting does that sound? But I hope we can get a little bit of an inside story, a bit of venture studios from you today. How does it actually work, and what's actually happening inside? How do you actually do it? And I think you said so. The model that you're running is a little bit different from a typical venture studio. So maybe for a start, if you can explain that a little bit to me.
Yeah, yeah. Um, let me start. Let me take one step back and then I'll go into my model. So, because right now, venture studios become very sort of sexy, hot, and the vast majority of startup studios have basically been in existence really for the last 2 to 4 years. It's exploded. Like 80% of all startup studios globally were founded in sort of 2019 onwards ish. So they've not been around that long. There are a few that have, but very, very few. But the vast majority of the volume are very, very new. And so, because it's still at its infancy as an investment asset class and really as a movement, there's still a lot of terminology that's often misused. So, like, how do you define a venture studio or a venture builder? And so the truth is, there's startup studio, venture builder. Like sometimes they call them labs or factories, but I think slowly now and they all generally mean the same thing, not incubator. But generally, they all mean the same thing. And realistically, now I'm seeing venture studio being probably the more often used phrase. Now, the real question is, what's the definition? So for me, the definition of a venture studio is an entity, because there's different ways you can structure it, but it's an entity that acts as a co-founder to a portfolio of companies. And the
Okay.
reason why I choose that definition is really important in terms of the word co-founder, because this showcases two important things that I think are true for what is required to be a startup studio or a venture studio. And that is the level of ownership that you get and the influence that you have. So the influence or the control. And those two things to me dictate that sort of the outcome of this. Like you act as a co-founder, and the truth is, studios are often there. They're building stuff in a greenfield mode from scratch. Most of them are doing their own ideation. There's various different models of how they go about it, but at its core, they're going to get an ownership stake, and they're going to have a lot more influence and like control than a normal investor would. And you're doing that across a portfolio of companies. That is what a venture studio is in my book. Now, there are certain things that I also go a little bit further on, which is just my preferences. So I think the ideation process of what ventures you create and work on is so strategically core to the long-term success of the studio. You should never outsource that. So in my view, I think a studio should always be doing their own ideation, and they should be building up that muscle, right? And the more ideation, the more ventures they launch, the stronger the business the studio becomes, the better it becomes at doing it, faster, better, stronger, whatever, right? And that's my personal view. Having said that, though, there are quite a few studios who have been very successful not doing that. So they've brought in like entrepreneurs with an idea and they sort of support them.
Uh-huh.
But but that's not how I personally would see it. And for the record, you have companies like Antler who call themselves a venture builder or a studio, and I think that's absolute nonsense. Antler to me is just a clone of Entrepreneur First, basically. And I
Uh-huh.
wouldn't call Entrepreneur First a venture builder either, personally. I think it's a twist on the accelerator business model, and it's ultimately an investment vehicle. But like, I get that. But I can unpack these things. But specific to what we do at Rainmaking Venture Studio or RVS, so we build new businesses or startups in partnership with large corporations on a no fee basis. So we never charge the corporate or any of our portfolio ventures any fees. Instead, via a fund, we invest millions of our own capital alongside our corporate partners as we go from root to fruit. And it's when we mutually like an idea, us and a corporate partner, we will then incorporate a new co in the relevant geography, so UK Limited, a German GmbH, a Delaware Corp in the US. Then we will create venture teams of proven founders, so a CEO and a CTO pair who've typically raised Series A before from Tier 1 VC. And then ourselves as fellow entrepreneurs and venture capitalists, help guide that process from incorporation through to acquisition or exit. Now, unique for us, the ventures that we build are aligned to our corporate partners' strategy from day one, and we aim to exit 90% of our successful ventures back to the corporate partner, typically at year five, so that they then fully own the
Okay.
scaled business and capture the lifetime value as the corporate continues to grow that business from say year five onwards. And so what we've done, for our corporate partners, it's super quick to get up and running. It's resource light because the teams are real entrepreneurs, proven founders building their teams. It's much more efficient use of capital because we're co-investing. But most importantly of all, what we've really cracked is what our approach de-risks the process of building new businesses for the corporate, for us, and for the founders we put into our portfolio ventures. So we get a much higher percentage success rate, and actually also a much higher return on investment than traditional venture capital in doing it in this way.
Okay. Okay, there's a lot to unpack here. A lot
Yeah,
of
I was going to pause.
a lot a lot of interesting topics to dive into, but if we start with the ideation part, and I think that that's going to be interesting for a lot of people. So you said that you think that that's an absolutely fundamental part of what you're doing. What is your ideation process? How do you even approach it? Is that you work very closely with your corporate partners and see what are the problems that they have? And I know that that's one approach of doing it that I've seen, but how do you, yeah, how do you do
Yeah.
that?
Basically, have two ways. One is where we call it corporate led, where for a given corporate partner, like a BNP Paribas, an Anglo American, a DPD, we pick a corporate partner, and with that corporate partner, we understand two things from them. One, what are their medium to long term strategic growth objectives? And what we're trying to sort of understand there is what's going to be strategically relevant, where we can try and find an adjacency to their core competencies today to build them a business that leverage some of their assets and capabilities, but is slightly adjacent to their core competencies, but strategically relevant. So they want to, this is the key question for our investment committee, if we build a highly profitable, highly scalable business, why is this corporate going to want to buy us out and take control and continue to scale it? So there has to have some
Yeah.
real strategic rationale of where that's going. The second thing that we want to understand is what are, in our words, we call them unfair advantages, but essentially, what are the scale strengths, the assets, the capabilities that the corporate has that we could leverage, that the venture could leverage to de-risk its growth, but also help it scale. So all of our ventures, when they plug in and they leverage these scale strengths, whether it's distribution, whether it's logistics fleets, whether it's warehousing real estate, core capabilities, banking regulation, once we leverage those, what we see with our ventures, not only do they scale faster than startups in the wild, they also reach scale at significantly lower cost of investment than a comparable startup in the wild because they're not having to build that scaled capability or infrastructure that we're basically pulling on from the corporate partner. And so we use those two things, the medium to long term strategic objectives or like strategic alignment from the corporate and their scale strengths. And we use those two things as constraints. So we then, at the intersection of those two, ideate ventures that we think would fit in that box. But what this does is it really helps us get better and more consistent ideation output because you're not starting with a blank canvas. You're not like blue ocean design thinking. You're going, well, hold on. We have to understand the industry they're in, the value chain they're in, where we think the future of that industry and that value chain in the markets they operate how that's going to evolve. That's kind of the strategic piece. And then we're understanding what are those assets, those capabilities, the distribution that we can leverage. And then we kind of like do a bit of cooking in between that and come up with a venture idea that sits within that. In terms of the investability of the venture, it's very, very similar to the VC mindset. So what I mean by that is the ambition level is the same as a VC because like we're working with some of the world's largest companies. We're literally working with Fortune 500s. They have multi-billions in revenue. And so their ambition level is the kind of the same as a VC. Like if I built them a 50 million pound business, they'd be like, what's the point? Like, why bother? So, it still needs to have that realistically believable chance over, say, a 7, maybe a 10-year period to get to $1 billion in valuation. So that ambition level is still the same. And everything else we look at is the standard sort of VC stuff like competition, timing, route to market, all the usual things. But the unique part of our model is given the fact that we're not starting from scratch, i.e. we have this corporate partner which we can leverage. This then means that we can be slightly later into certain markets than a traditional VC would be. And so what I mean by that is we could see maybe 2, 3 really well-funded Series A startups doing something super cool. And we go, that's really cool. Love what they're doing. And if you're a VC like in Europe and they're like, oh, well, that's kind of like, I should have invested in that time. I missed that investment opportunity. The market's gone. For us, we're like, no. We'll happily turn up to the party 3, 4 years late in some cases because we're turning up to a knife fight with an AK-47 that the corporate's providing us, right? So it's like, yeah, sure. How long? Because often there's this phrase. Can't remember who it was, Steve Blank or someone like that, or Mark Andreessen. Someone said, the real trick is when it talks about corporate innovation is will the startups get distribution before the corporates figure out innovation? And often we're going, well, we're going to have all the best of startup land, so we'll do all the digital stuff and all that. We'll have real founders building this business, but we're plugging into their millions of customers from day one. Well, I can happily turn up to the party 3 or 4 years late. So there's certain things when it comes to like market timing that are different for us in our asset class, but there are also some other things. So what we found, for example, is over experience of having done this for many, many years, we've not found a corporate. Basically, if the venture can't prove fundamental profitability by the end of year 3, the corporate gets really, really nervous. So they're simply not willing to take like a Silicon Valley mindset of like, oh, we'll build a marketplace and 7 years later it might hit profitability, or they can't get their heads around that. And so this means that although our investment mandate doesn't preclude us from doing this. Practically, we don't make investment decisions where we can't see a clear line of sight for our venture to get to 10 million of profit by the end of year three. That doesn't mean that they're actually distributing any profit out. Of course not. All of any theoretical profit that's made is reinvested in growth. We're trying to grow as fast as possible. But the concept here is we need to be able to prove to our corporate partner that this thing is fundamentally a profitable business. Because if we don't prove that, they get very nervous and things become very, very difficult for us and the founders.
Okay, that makes sense. And then, okay, so that's mostly the idea. Yeah.
That's the ideation from a corporate-led perspective. The other one, which is a lot quicker, is venture-led, which is where we come up with an idea. We say, oh, we really want to build this. Then who are the kind of corporates that would be suited for that idea? So we might come up with an idea which would be like, well, pretty much any retail bank would be great. So we would then come up with an idea and then approach Barclays, Lloyds, NatWest, right? And be like, hey, we want to build this. We're talking to all your competition. This is the stuff we want from you. This is why we think it'll be good for you. Yes or no? And so that's a second way where we do our own ideation, but often, and this comes back to my previous comment around the importance of not outsourcing this. So the more we look at certain industries, the more we understand, the more corporates we work with, the more ventures we build, it's the same people doing that. And so we get way better at becoming more venture-led. Historically, it was like all corporate-led because we were like, I don't know. And that was actually very exciting because in fairness, we've now ended up in certain industries and sectors with ventures that we would never have built by ourselves. So like we built 2 ventures with Cemex, a big cement manufacturer, and it's like they're in construction. And it's like, I would never have built a construction tech startup, like if Cemex didn't sort of pull me into that industry. Now, the truth is, it is highly possible that one of those ventures might be our biggest venture ever in terms of investment returns. And it's really interesting because like construction industry is massive. Like any country, roughly 13% of their GDP is construction. Hugely fragmented, loads of SMEs, zero digitization. It's like there's a lot of low-hanging fruit. There's some really basic problems that they have that can be solved with some pretty basic tech. And so you're like, yeah, it's like shooting fish. Now, having said that though, getting into the construction industry without a major construction player is hard because it's quite a walled garden, right? It is a little bit who you know and who has influence. So we were looking at a software solution where we were trying to get these big 3PLs, these big logistics companies that do like these huge trucks with like tons of earth, heavy building materials and like building aggregates. Most of the heavy building materials companies in the UK and actually throughout Europe don't own their fleets anymore. They've outsourced them to big 3PL carriers. But no one's really, the digitization of that logistics, that final mile delivery of these like heavy building materials has only just begun in the last couple of years. But like when we turn up with Cemex can mandate all of their 3PLs to have to use the software. Otherwise they don't get the contract. If I was a startup trying to sell the software to like hauliers or whatever in the wild, like it would never happen. It would take 10 years to get adoption because the industry is kind of digital adverse. So you really need like quite a lot of levers to get like truck drivers and, these kind of family owned weird Nottingham based hauliers to digitize. It takes an incumbent to kind of give you access to certain industries like that. So that's cool because the corporates have taken us down that road. But now, having been in this quite a few years, we're now slowly developing our own loose investment thesis about saying, okay, what kind of businesses we want to build? Who do we think are good corporate partners? Now, when we do the venture-led ideation, there is only one constraint from us, which is we don't want to be ideating a venture which we can only try and sell to like one corporate. So because that one-to-one sale probably won't happen because you're going to have to convince a corporate to partner in and invest with you. So you want kind of at least 10 looky-likey corporates that you could approach where then one of them will say yes. So whether it's 10 banks, are there 10 logistics companies? Probably not. There's like DHL, FedEx, and DPD. There aren't that many. So there are certain industries in which we gravitate towards because we still have to go sell this. And so the conversion rate on the sale needs to be believable. And so I can't just build something for a corporate customer of one in a venture-led approach.
Yeah. I understand. Okay, that makes a lot of sense. And then, so what are the first kind of steps when you after the ideation? So you mentioned before you established a team of proven founders, and that's one interesting challenge, I would imagine. And then, do you have some kind of, do you somehow test the idea? I suppose you set some kind of goals. I guess you commit certain amount of funding in the beginning, set some targets. How does that work?
Yeah. I'll walk you through kind of like how our model works and then kind of the learnings of why we've got to here. So generally speaking, our model has like 4 stages. The first stage is what we call the pre-seed round. And this is where, as I kind of alluded to in a corporate-led approach, where, within the constraints of a corporate strategic, growth objectives, overlapping with their unique scale strengths, we will then ideate new venture concepts for them. And the output of the sort of 6 to 8 week process is a detailed investment pack that we first present to our independent investment committee at our fund for Series Seed approval. We share the outputs along with the commentary and ultimately the decision from our IC, Invest or Pass, to the corporate. There's no obligation for them to do anything with that. If they mutually agree that the venture is investable, we then immediately incorporate the new co. We hire the founders, the CEO, CTO, and then we collectively invest the seed round, which we do 50-50 with the corporate. So in the UK, that's £600,000. We do 300, they do 300. Now this varies from geography to geography. Germany, it's €700,000, slightly more in France, a lot more in the US. But the principle there is the seed round gives the founders and their small team 12 to 14 months of runway to sort of iterate their business and prove some product market fit. And then if all is going well, the founders approach us as in, Rainmaking and the corporate as the only two investors. We never syndicate in the wild with external VCs with their sort of Series A round ask or their next round ask. And so they might say, hey, I want 6 million based on these proof points to execute this sort of rough plan. And again, there's no obligation for us as the corporate to invest further. But if we assume or decide it's essentially investable, then us and the corporate decide how we split the Series A. Is it 3 million each? Is it 4 and 2? And the only reason why that's relevant is, the more money we put in or the more money they put in, the more equity each one of us gets. That's kind of obvious. But most importantly, as part of the Series A round, we agree a valuation formula for the corporate's effectively call option, which provides them with the exclusive rights to acquire 100% of the business, typically year 5, typically based on some multiple of revenue plus growth ratchet and so on. Alternatively, if the corporate doesn't want to buy the business, which is it's a right and non-obligation, we basically remove them from the board, take away a ton of equity, readjust the cap table, and then we basically seek an exit in the wild. So the venture then turns into a normal startup, raises money in the wild from traditional VCs and looks to exit in the wild. That's plan B though for us. So that's kind of our model. Now coming back to the main point which you were talking about, which is really, how much validation do we do? How do we bring in the founders? What does that look like?
Yeah.
So historically, we used to do the first maybe 3, 6, 9 months of execution. And so we would do all the customer development. We would do like the initial MVP landing page, de-risk the stuff and put in quite clear, business case before we did the seed investment. And what we've realized is that got us worse results than what we do today, which is we have a very loose touch concept. We bring in real founders and say, you got 600,000, go fucking build it however you want. And the reason why the former approach got worse results is 2 main reasons. One was When you try to raise or hire, recruit founders, when you've done, say, 6, 9 months of execution, at that point, you've got very strong opinions of how the product should be built and what the go-to-market might look like and all of these things. And so the best founder talent essentially hears that and listens and basically says, well, hold on, you're trying to hire me to build your idea. Like, go fuck yourself. Like, I'm not,
Yeah.
I'm not an employee. I build my business, my idea. Like, there's an element where it becomes a bit too like recipe driven. And so the best founders, it's a bit of a turn off. And ultimately, you want the best founders because they're the number one reason that drives to business success and investment returns. And so the first issue you have is when you do that, you struggle to get the best talent. Secondly, even if you did manage to get the best entrepreneurial talent, the reality is it's so early stage, it's so fuzzy. All the customer development you've done, all the landing page, all that sort of early stage, validation, experimentation, is so experiential. I can't really hand over that knowledge. I can tell people, hey, you should build a product this way, but they don't know why. They haven't really felt it. So what ends up really happening is the founders then come in and basically repeat all, if not half at the very least, of everything you've already done because they need to figure the shit out for themselves. And so you're just
Yeah.
wasting time and money doing it that way. And so that's why, we don't do any of those validation stuff anymore. Instead, we get to a concept where we basically say, look, here's a business plan, here's how we think we'd build it, but it's not a recipe you have to follow. But we're pretty convinced that with the right co-founding pair, there is enough room in this market opportunity to iterate to a successful startup. And so that's all we're really doing. And then we bring in a CEO and a CTO pair. They've got that 12 months of runway. They've got all the corporate partner advantages lined up, contractually obligated that they have to deliver to this venture. And away they go. And they build it from scratch. And what is different about our startup studio versus a lot of others is ultimately, as kind of alluded to at the beginning of our chat, startup studios basically get a ton, like essentially a co-founding equity stake. It varies from venture builder to venture builder, but typically it's around 20%. And so they'll end up with 20% of equity. And in order to justify your position as a startup studio on a cap table, I mean, like you're getting 20% like common equity. How do you justify that? Essentially, how every startup studio does that is they throw human capital at the problem. So they'll say stuff like, oh, we've got really experienced founders, we've got some developers and designers, and like we help you build your business. We've got like a cool process. And so they over-index on like trying to give sweat or human capital and like process or things to justify that 20% stake. We don't. We don't have to, right? Our model is so different with the corporate who's tied up to it. That's basically why it's there. And so we have a very different situation where we're hiring always our founders are second or third time VC backed founders. We do not ingest first time founders. Why? Because we get way better investment returns by doing second or third time founders. Some of them even have huge exits under their belts and they're just coming back for a kind of another tour of duty in a slightly de-risked way to have some fun at being a founder again. And we get amazing talent in. And so, sure, my co-founders and I have our own entrepreneurial experiences. And, my co-founders even had an IPO and, we've been VCs, both of us. And so we hope we can bring a lot of value and add some value. But the reality is these people are so experienced, like you leave them alone to build their business. But what we do turn up with is a model. We have the buyer baked in from day one. We have all the contractual
Yeah.
terms to be able to like wrestle the good stuff out of the corporate, right? And so it is a different path to being a founder in a different asset class because I would say between 1 and 3 and 1 and 2, I'd probably say 40% of every venture we incorporate exits. And that is a fundamentally different risk profile to trying to build a startup in the
Yeah.
wild.
Yeah.
Also,
Absolutely.
for the founders, not only do they turn up from day one, they've never have to raise money, basically. Money's in there. They spend pretty much all their time just building the business. They've got the corporate partner de-risking it, right? They they've got 40% chance, if not greater, of exit. The exit will happen year five latest, not 7 to 11 years down the road. Now, admittedly, they're not going to
Hmm.
be a billionaire in our exit, but they'll happily walk away with 10 to 20 mil,
Hmm.
right?
Hmm.
So it's a different approach to what we're doing. But yeah, I hope that answers your question around sort of like how we do it in kind of the early stages.
It does. It does. It's fascinating to me. You have this incredibly clear strategy of how it all works. It's. But do you know who's Andrew Wilkinson from Tiny Capital?
I
Ever
don't
came
know.
across him?
No, I haven't.
You remind me of him a lot. So Tiny Capital is their model is slightly different. Their model is well completely different to be honest. They buy businesses. They buy typically small tech companies, not exclusively, but that's their core thing. They buy small tech companies and they own them, and they typically just change the CEO because usually it's somebody who's been running the business for 5 to 10 years. They're tired, they don't want to do it anymore, so they just replace the CEO or the senior management. On the CEO's request, not because they come in and they change everything. They
Mm.
kind of keep the business as it is, and they've been doing that. I mean, they're massively successful. Their portfolio is worth, I mean, over $1 billion for sure, but it
Wow.
could be billions of dollars. I'm not entirely sure. And they have a portfolio of, I want to say, 50 or so companies, possibly more by now. They do
Wow.
some investments as well. They do some venture investing. They do some angel investing. They do all sorts of things. But their main thing is just buy profitable, successful, small-ish tech companies, and then they just keep running them. But what's interesting is he also has this incredibly clear strategy on how they do it. And I think they went through somewhat of a similar journey where in the beginning they used to be very hands-on, very, very involved. They would constantly work together with the CEOs. And now they they just I think they only do like yearly reports from the CEOs. They're like, well, just once a year, send me the numbers. If there's a shit show, let me know. But otherwise, just do your thing. Like you know what you're doing. It's your business. The more we're involved, the worse it gets because we just we don't know the business as much as you do because you're running it. So it sounds. I see a lot
Yeah.
of similarities there between what you were saying and between what they're doing.
It's also an interesting question because like when I was doing before Rainmaking Venture Studio, when I was doing my own startup studio, we had a real issue which was in my opinion most startup studios don't scale. And it's exactly to this point you're alluding to. So what they do is they basically launch maybe three, four, five ventures, something like that. But it tends to be single digits, right?
Mm,
Let's call it six. Let's say they've got six bullets in the old school revolver, right? Six chambers, right? So they launch
mm,
six ventures. In order to justify their position on the cap table, they're pumping in tons and tons of human resource and capital into the business, a lot of attention to sort of justify what's going on. And there's a limit to how many employees they have, right? So they can't just
mm,
grow and double the size of their team without raising more money. And where's that management fee
mm,
going to come from? And so practically what ends up happening is they launch, four to six ventures, and then they're stuck. And they have to wait for one of
mm,
them to die or one of them to like exit or spin out before they can do anything else. And so they hit this like terminal velocity. And so what you end up having is a business that's actually not scalable. Now, you hope that
mm,
and you trust that, one in the six, two in the six, three in the six, maybe four in the six, do really, really well and you make tons of money. But like think about the time period, right? How long is it going to
yeah,
take to
yeah, yeah.
create the six, hit the terminal velocity, wait for a new bullet to create, you'll be like 10 years down the road, right? Before you've kind of
Yeah,
got, and
yeah.
so it's one of those things where like for me, once I felt that, because I felt that problem in my first startup studio, and I was like, I don't want to I want to design a business where that isn't an issue. I don't, because
Hmm.
fundamentally, one of the things that I struggled with when I was building our consultancy business at Rainmaking Innovation, when I first did it, it was, to be honest, around this sort of like the intellectual masturbation around like why are corporates struggling to innovate? It's like a really interesting problem. No one's got an answer. Let's try and crack that. And intellectually, it was really interesting. And at the beginning of that journey, I also found it intellectually interesting to build a non-scalable business model. I was like, as someone who's basically been a startup like founder like all my life, I was like, well, hold on, this is like an agency, right? Now it makes money from day one, like that's great, but like you win more projects, you hire more people, right? You know, you have to keep
Yeah.
winning more projects to keep the people you have, and then and so it scales linearly, and you're then worrying about like billability, and so it doesn't scale like a startup does. And so for me, you can grow large consultancy business. Don't get me wrong. I mean, like, Accenture's massive, right? But like,
Yeah.
you
Yeah.
know,
Yeah.
what my point being is most consultancies grow by actually M&A in the end. They actually acquire loads of small versions of themselves, they build them together, and that's actually how they get to a really big size, pretty much across the board. Now, the problem is I still look at the fundamentals of the business model and go, it's non-scalable. And I found it hugely frustrating because you're putting in all this effort and you're basically limited to time and materials. You're like, well, hold on. What can we basically, given our brand, our credibility, how can we charge, how much can we charge people out for per day? That's basically what it boils down to. And you end up in this valuation scenario, which is like, McKinsey partner, maybe they're charging out £10,000 a day, which is insane. But it's like, that's it. That's the ceiling. You never get, and like realistically, are
Yeah.
you ever
Yeah.
going to
Yeah.
get that
Yeah.
brand of like McKinsey that McKinsey has like
Yeah.
anytime soon? No. So maybe you're charging out two
Yeah.
grand a day, but like that's it. And you're stuck in this trap of like time and materials. And as someone who's been a tech founder, I found that infuriating. And the weirdest thing is I see this happen a little bit with startup studio founders who don't know, like it's so exciting. They're like, oh, let's do a studio, let's do venture building. And there's so much excitement about this, but people don't know the actual business model that well. They don't know operationally how to run these things that well. Like there's so many things they don't know. And they go into it with real naivety and excitement, as did I, but they like they're often trapping themselves in a business model that's fundamentally not scalable, right? And there's some issues like that, and there's some other issues around, opinions about do you back single founders or founder pairs? When do you bring in the founders? Who comes with the ideas? Do you generate them? Do you bring them in? But also, how do you kill something? When is something just
Yeah.
requires a bit more perseverance and a bit more money to like pivot to something cool? Or when do you call quits on it? And how do you do that? And
Yeah.
like, do you have shared resources? So like, if you have developers and designers in the studio,
Yeah.
do you allow them to work across multiple projects? Or do you put them into a startup and then, they just are stuck with that startup from root to fruit? So there's all these questions
Yeah.
that you have to answer for yourself if you're going to run a startup studio. And most people who've never done it don't know what the right answers are. And look, there are many ways to skin this cat. I have very strong opinions about the right ways to do this because of
Yeah.
my experiences. But yeah, it's this one thing where actually startup studios often get stuck in this sort of six barrels, right, or six bullets issue because they're too ingrained with the support they're giving to their portfolio. And intentionally with RVS, we designed a business model that wasn't going to fall into that trap, which meant we were building a business model which ingested very experienced founders, which had other ways to justify our position on the cap table, and meant that we didn't get stuck in portfolio management that limited our growth.
So speaking of the founders, you touched on that a little bit before, and that's obviously a key part of your model, right? You find smart people with proven track record of success, and then you incentivize them correctly and you let them do their thing, which sounds good, but I think it could be quite tricky because, I mean, first of all, I guess there aren't that many founders out there just kind of looking around for the next thing. And if there are, they might just want to do their thing. So I'm curious, firstly, how do
Yeah.
you find them? And then maybe secondly, also, is there anything else that you're looking for in your founders or CEOs or the initial team besides that proven track record of success?
Well, I wouldn't say success. I think what we really look for is people who've raised VC money before and been a VC-backed
Okay.
founder before. Whether that first business or second business succeeded or failed, don't really care. It's about they've been through that
Okay.
experience before. Now, for us, when we started this business, the founder talent piece was the bit I was most worried about. was like, oh my God, like how are we going to solve that? That's going to be so critical. And it's turned out to be the bit that actually works the best. Like, I was like, I was like, ideation, corporates will love this, like, getting access, like all of these things, like, that's going to be easy. It's the founders that are going to be critical. And the reality is, how we do it is very simple. So we get the investment pack, right? And for that investment pack, we know roughly what the business is going to be, right? Is it a B2B business? Is it a direct to
Yeah.
consumer business?
Yeah.
What industry it's in it? Like, and so we look at kind of what we're trying to achieve, and we're saying, okay, it's in this industry. It's probably going to need these key skill sets, like whether it's enterprise sales or PPC marketing, or like the product's going to be easy or hard. And so both technical, non-technical, we're kind of looking at what are the key skill sets we think we want to prioritize. And then our head of talent, Anna, who's our head of talent within the studio, just recruits these people. They headhunt them. In the beginning, we thought all of these founders would come from our networks, like Startup Bootcamp. We've got over 1,000 startups that we've invested in. Not all of them are still alive. We've been heavily involved in startup ecosystems across Europe and North America. I thought a lot of this stuff would come from my network. And the reality of the situation is, given a very specific business case, the truth is we get way higher conversion by just headhunting founders. And so we'll headhunt a bunch of founders and say, look, we're building this business with this corporate partner. Here's the investment pack. Here's the deal. Like, are you in? Are you out? Like, and truth be told, we've not really struggled. Even in industries like construction tech, where I was really worried, I was like, how are we going to find people in that? And that is a byproduct of where we operate. We are launched, so we've got portfolio businesses, ventures in Germany, the Nordics, France, UK, and America. And realistically, what this means is we're Western Europe and North America. And when you look at the startup ecosystems in London, in Berlin, and Paris, actually, they're mature. The US is super mature. There's actually quite a few post, seed, Series A, venture-backed
Yeah.
founders out there. And the reality is we don't need
Yeah.
many. Like a studio for us will launch 4 to 6 startups a year. That's maximum 12 founders. That's 6 CEOs and 6 CTOs in a 12-month period. It's not much per studio. So it's not huge volume. These are mature startup ecosystems, and the founder talent that that resonates with our proposition tend to be a little later stage in life. So they tend to be sort of mid to late 30s, mid to late 40s. They've raised money before, they've done a startup before. Some of them have had successful exits, but often they're all at that later stage in life where they're like, they want to stay being entrepreneurial and being a founder, but they don't really want to go back to sweating it out and be like, shit, I don't have an idea. How am I going
Yeah.
to get an idea? I'm going to have to take
Yeah.
12 months to raise my seed round, or maybe 9 months to raise my seed round
Yeah.
if I'm a little bit better. But then I'm going to have to raise money. And then it's like, And suddenly we're approaching them with this sort of de-risked opportunity to be a founder, where it's like, look, your money's there. It's a corporate partner. You'll have slightly less equity, but actually you've got higher chance of exit. It'll happen slightly sooner, and you have full autonomy like you would normally have in a normal startup to build it, your way, your culture, your people, it's your business. I've given you the money, you spend it how you want. We don't ever set them any KPIs because that's weird. Like VCs don't set founders KPIs, right? The
Yeah.
reality is, as they're running out of money, they come and ask for more money and try to raise money. And you look at what they've done and who they are, and you decide whether you want to give them more money or not. We do exactly the same thing, right? We never set any KPIs or predetermined elements. Corporates always ask us to, and we say, no, no, no. The reason being is you get worse investment outcomes if you set these KPIs. Because often when you're setting these targets, you're setting them from the point of most ignorance. You've not actually gone and done it. You don't actually know how it's
Yeah.
going to
Yeah.
happen. So
Yeah.
it's like,
Exactly. Yeah.
you're just making shit up. Stop doing that.
Yeah.
And so we give our founders complete freedom. And obviously there are certain things that they can't do without board approval. So they can't sell the company, issue new shares, change
Yeah.
articles of association. But that's all the standard VC stuff, right? There is no different, right? in terms of founder-friendly terms. If anything, we're slightly more founder-friendly than traditional VCs are. So, for example, we give them additional security, which is we can't let go of a founder without the other founder voting in favor of it. And it has to be a unanimous board decision with the other founder approving. Otherwise, we can't remove a founder. And that doesn't exist in a normal VC. And there are a few other things we do that are unique to our model that are a bit more founder friendly. But the reality is, we often get people who are sort of later stage in life. They've got mortgages, they've got kids, they don't necessarily have an idea, they don't really want to become an employee again. And we just give them kind of like, an oven ready, pre baked, here's the thing. Now, they ask a million
Yeah.
questions about the corporate, about the concept, and we still have to look for passion fit. They've got to really believe in the
Hmm.
mission, and they've got to turn it and make it their own. But we've actually not struggled to date, touch wood. We have genuinely not struggled with our founder recruitment. We fired one CEO once, which we replaced, which was a bit troubling. But outside of that, I think the thing that my co-founders and I are most proud about is the founder talent in our portfolio ventures. They're insane. So yeah, it's kind of weird. We have problems with our business elsewhere that really like challenge me and keep me awake at night, but recruiting amazing founders for our portfolio ventures in these markets is not an issue. But this is why I don't go to the Middle East. This is why I don't go to Southeast Asia, because you try and hire experienced founders in any of those regions, they don't exist. Well, they do, but very few of them.
Yeah. Fascinating, interesting. It was definitely not, yeah, definitely not what I was expecting. I would also expect that to be a more difficult part, the challenging part of the business. I don't want to go on for too long, but I would love to talk about one more thing, probably the last question, but if you can talk a little bit about your portfolio. We haven't really talked much about it, about as much as you can share in terms of how many companies you launched so far, maybe any numbers that you're able to share, so they get a better sense of what you've built so far.
Yeah. So this is where it gets a bit complicated. And so before doing Rainmaking Venture Studio, Rainmaking within their consulting business was doing corporate venture building, right? And it's been an
Okay.
evolution. So, we started our very first venture building project in 2015, 2014 with Jaguar Land Rover, where, we did some strategy work with them. And anyway, long story short, we ended up building digital mobility startups with Jaguar Land Rover. And that was our sort of first corporate client. And that was purely for fees. And then we were like fees plus equity. And then we basically came to the conclusion that you couldn't consistently build successful ventures within the constraints of a professional services firm. Ultimately, you had a misalignment of incentives. And so we ripped out all of our corporate venture building activities from our consultancy business, and we raised a ton of money to do this no fees co-investment model, right? Because if you think about RVS, the business never makes any revenues. We never charge anyone anything. So
Yeah.
we've got to raise money to cover my entire team's cost to create the deal flow, right? And then we've got to raise more money
Yeah.
to co-invest alongside our corporates, pound for pound, dollar for dollar.
Yeah.
So, that took us a while. And so we set up RVS officially in 2019. We got the money in, the first chunks of money in to get going. And in 2019 in the UK, our current portfolio is only seven. But we've got studios in Germany, studios in the Nordics. We got ventures in North America. We don't currently have too many boots on the ground, a full studio yet in North America. But then we've got the track record that enabled us to raise this money. So there are a bunch of ventures in the wider portfolio that were born in a fees plus equity model, right? That we have exited, that are still there. And there's loads of those. But in this pure no fees co-investment model, in my UK studio, we've got seven. Hopefully, we'll touch wood. We're going to sort of nine by the end of this year. But that's kind of where we're at. I mean, we basically do 4 to 6 ventures a year, but we went through COVID, and 2020 was basically we launched 2 ventures in 2020.
Uh-huh.
Corporates went mental. So, and then Germany, the Nordics. So yeah, we've got a few more ventures around, but maybe you double it, something like that.
Got it. Got it.
Um,
All right. Um,
I
I
mean,
don't know. Is there anything else that I forgot to ask you? Is there anything else that you think we should talk about? I could go on about this for the whole day because I find it really fascinating. But I also
I'll tell
want to
you
be
what.
respectful of your time and the listeners' time.
Let me let me give you an example of one of our portfolio ventures because it just brings it to life. A lot of this stuff is
Yes.
kind of quite theoretical, and so
Yes.
let's
Yeah.
try and finish with that.
Yeah. Yeah.
A good example is a business we built with BNP Paribas. It's a huge French bank. Actually, it's with their insurance division. So BNP Paribas Cardiff, which is a multi-billion euro insurer, they have a division which is essentially it's kind of a monopoly, but basically they're the largest provider of extended vehicle warranty and maintenance products for used cars. And the way their business basically works is in France, there's a law where if you're a car dealer, a traditional car dealer, and if I sell a used car, I have to by law sell it with a minimum of 6 months warranty attached to the sale. And then I try and upsell you some sort of maintenance product that I can make quite a lot of money on in terms of this other insurance product, right? And so basically, they've got to a point now where they've got 3,000 car dealers around France. When these car dealers sell a used car, a warranty product gets attached to it, and then there's a potential upsell on a maintenance product. They've got in France, they've got about 750,000 customers or policyholders currently, or something like that, within that business. And then they've got relationships with 24,000 garages. So auto repair shops or garages where, if you had an accident or you want to do routine maintenance, you go to one of these garages, you get it fixed, and that's how they process the claims. And they do about 300,000-ish claims a year that go through their business in France. And they came to us with two problems. They said, well, first one, we've got a real issue on growth. I said, what do you mean? They said, well, basically, we've got every car dealer there is to get in France. And we're trying to internationalize. So we're trying to go into Germany and Italy, and that's going to take some time. And it's quite a slow burn. But ultimately, we've got zero growth. Realistically, it's flatline growth, it's single digit growth. If car dealers in France sell more used cars, they sell more insurance products. That's it. And then the second problem they came to us with was more of an existential crisis, which was given the rise of these unicorn startups, which are actually vertically integrated digital car dealers like Kazoo, Cinch, these super well-funded unicorn startups are basically buying fleets of cars, hundreds and thousands of cars, and flogging them online. And what that really causes a problem for is as these sort of startups do more and more used car sales purely online, that's going to erode the business of the traditional physical car dealers, right? And if those physical car dealers disappear, BNP Paribas insurance business disappears.
Yeah.
And so they're really worried about the growth of these startups, and they were trying to figure out what can we do to sort of future-proof our business model and drive new growth. So that was the problem they gave us. So we looked at their strategic objectives, we looked at their assets and their capabilities, and what we ended up building with them was a company which is a used car auction marketplace. And the way it works is if you've got a used car, you basically put the registration number in of your car. You take a few photos and videos of the car itself. We enrich the data of that asset, and then we send it to 3,000 car dealers nationwide who bid to buy the car from you. It's an auction. Highest bidder wins. We transfer you the money instantaneously, and then the startup comes to your front door, collects your car, and transports it nationwide to the car dealer that bought it anywhere in France. And we take a commission for doing that. The business is hugely successful. It's in France. It's called Wheelie, which is weirdly, that's how it's pronounced in French. It's weirdly spelt for an English person as Wyllly, but really.
Okay.
Anyway, it's doing phenomenally well, and it's making a shit ton of money selling these used cars. And what's really cool about it is if you think about there's two things. One, what do you need to build that business if you want to build it? Well, on the demand side, you need a load of car dealers. BNP Paribas have car dealers. They've got 20 regional salespeople. They've got software in the store with their current insurance products in the dealerships
Yeah.
already being used. So that gives you the demand side. And then you say, well, okay, well, on the supply side, we're going to need like used car owners. Well, they've got 750,000 used car owners in France who they currently have as customers. Now, insurers aren't that great at marketing to their customers, but they are helpful. And the wider bank, the retail bank, BNP Paribas, has way better distribution channels to promote and market this business. But they've got real distribution channels to get the supply side as well. That's freaking awesome. And then it turns out on the supply side as well that these 300,000 claims that are happening every year where someone is driving into a garage to get their car fixed or the maintenance done turns out to be a really good customer physical touch point for customer acquisition. So what we figured out is we work with these garages and we say to them, if you can convince this guy to sell their car on our platform, we'll give you a cut. So we'll give you 300-400 euros. And so now these garages for all of these 300,000 claims are now becoming a really effective customer acquisition and conversion mechanic for the marketplace. Brilliant. But it doesn't just get better than that. It gets even better. And so when we speak to these garage owners, it turns out that these sort of like, small independently owned run businesses, they will opportunistically buy and sell maybe 6 cars a year. So someone will come into the garage and they're like, oh, it's a Renault, I give you 5,000 euros. And then they sort of sell it and they make some profit. And the profit they make on those sort of 5 or 6 opportunistic car sales is actually a significant part of their yearly profits as a small business. And then you sort of figure this out, and then you ask these owners, like, why do you not do more of this? And they're like, well, 2 things. One, I don't really have time to look for cars, so if they come into my shop, they come into my shop, whatever. 2, often some good deals come into my car, but I don't have the cash on hand to buy. I don't have the 5,000 euros. So they don't have the working capital. So now we plug in BNP Paribas, the bank, and now we're providing lending, and we're saying, hey, asset-backed lending against a used car, no problem. We're making a ton of money on the lending. And then what's amazing is as these sort of garages are being converted into like micro car dealers, every single time they sell a car, we're like, hey, you need warranty with that. 6 months warranty. Hey, you could upsell on maintenance. And this is flywheeling, the core insurance business of BNP Paribas. But at its core, it has achieved the 2 objectives. We need growth. We need more growth, more profits. Well, we're giving you a ton of that. 2, we need to future-proof our business. Well, we are driving footfall and strengthening the traditional car dealers. And we're providing an alternative to a kazoo option. And so what we're really doing is we're solidifying your current core distribution in your core business while also flywheeling this and making a ton of money on lending and a few other things. But that gives you an example of the types of ventures we build with our corporate partners and why it's a win-win-win. It's a win for us, it's a win for them, it's a win for the founders.
Yeah, that just super clearly demonstrates how the model works and how it makes sense and what's the benefit of it, of having that corporate partner in. Fascinating. Jordan, thank you so much. I loved the conversation. I think you're very good at explaining what you're doing, and I appreciate all the transparency and all the things that you shared. And I think a lot of people are going to really enjoy this. So thank you so much.
Thanks, Matt. Really appreciate it. It's been fun being on.
Take care now.
Yeah, you too.
Thanks for listening until the end. I hope you enjoyed it. If you like the content, please do me a favor and click the like button on YouTube or give us 5 stars on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, wherever it is that you listen to your podcasts. Leave a comment, subscribe if you want to hear more from us. That really helps also to get the podcast out there, and that helps me get more interesting guests and create even more interesting content. So I really appreciate if you do that. If you have any other comments, questions, feel free to message me. You can find me on Twitter. That's usually the best channel. The link should be somewhere in the description. And check out my Twitter. I try to tweet interesting stuff about similar content that we talk about on the podcast, key insights from the podcast as well, and just generally stuff that I learn and stuff that I do. So see you. Thanks.